I have people in here, they're fighting, they're screaming, one's got a stick.
When a 911 call comes in, who responds and what options are immediately available can make a difference between life and death.
Sometimes a police response actually makes a situation less safe.
We just want to make sure you're okay.
But as Seattle grapples with pressure to change its approach to public safety, it's also struggling to keep the officers it has.
Staffing is a real challenge.
Do you need socks?
And social service agencies warn our behavioral health system is overwhelmed.
Our collective safety is being compromised.
Will a new statewide hotline help? And will adding a new team of civilian mental health specialists for non-medical, non-violent 911 calls make the community safer?
And there'll be some growing pains, I'm sure.
Our studio panel weighs in.
I hope that it makes sure that we have community safety for all people, not just business owners and homeowners.
What's going on, hon?
A new direction for Seattle's crisis response. Next on City Inside Out. Welcome to this edition of City Inside Out. I'm your host, Brian Callanan. Seattle is trying to improve public safety by changing its approach. Specialized firefighter teams now tackle some of Seattle's non-acute medical calls. Police officers will soon have more support on behavioral health calls. And our 911 dispatch center has become part of an entirely new city department. These moves are designed to get people in crisis the help they need and keep first responders ready for more serious emergencies. But with these changes to Seattle's crisis response system, there are complications from some new state regulations and an overall lack of social service resources that are challenging the effort to make Seattle safer for everyone. The need to reform police practices and our behavioral health care system came into sharp focus last year in the wake of the murder of George Floyd.
I think that we have a lot of urgency.
Seattle City Councilmember Lisa Herbold, chair of the Public Safety Committee, helped usher in some changes, starting with 911.
Ignore 32, ignore 3 for a crisis call.
We have to really look at prioritizing which calls get responded to by an officer, the highest priority calls, the calls that only they can respond to, and who can respond to other calls.
The City Council moved the 911 call center into a new Community Safety and Communication Center, or CSCC.
We're taking a huge step forward today.
The city also stood up a new Health One team of firefighters to respond to non-urgent health calls and plans to have a new Triage One team online next year to handle non-emergency police calls. At the state level, lawmakers established a 988 behavioral health hotline that comes online in July of 2022. And with House Bill 1310, the state established new rules for how officers can use force.
Put your hands behind your back.
If they can't articulate a basis for a use of physical force with an uncooperative or resistant subject, then officers are expected to disengage.
That change in police policy has turned into a serious challenge for Daniel Malone.
We do have a fair amount of medical crisis events that we need to call 911 for.
Malone is executive director of the Downtown Emergency Service Center, which mainly serves people facing chronic homelessness, and which also contracts with the city to assist on crisis response.
Our mobile crisis team has really felt this.
Studies show after HB 1310 was put in place, many officers have been unwilling to help with the involuntary commitments sometimes needed for people with severe behavioral health issues.
Our collective safety is being compromised there.
Law enforcement officials and service providers held a summit to address this issue in October and are also hoping to get more clarity from the state on HB 1310. But Malone says this is far from the only challenge our region is facing, as a mental health crisis, exacerbated by the ongoing pandemic, pushes the limits of an already stretched system.
We have a totally inadequate response to the level of need that we have in the community, and that's been building for a really long time.
It's a challenge Mark Baird knows very well.
Public safety being the number one thing. nobody wants to see anybody put in a bad situation or put into harm's way.
Baird is the chief operating officer for the Seattle Police Department and hopes the city's decision to move the 911 call center to a new department outside the SPD will be a positive step.
Both of the new CSCC and SPD are definitely invested and interested in the mutual success of both departments.
But both departments have some personnel issues, with 320 officers leaving the SPD in the past year and a half, and the call center operating at about only 60% of the staffing level it needs.
911, what are you reporting?
The city is investing in hiring bonuses to get more call takers and dispatchers, and putting more money into housing, shelter, and behavioral health services too. But Baird says scaling up those community-based services to help police needs to happen 24 hours a day before officers can take a step back.
Normally, you'd like to be able to turn up a new policy initiative. In this case, it would be this alternative response, ahead of where you would turn down what is currently providing that service.
About 900,000 calls come in to Seattle's 911 system every year. The council, mayor, and SPD agree that at least 12% of them could be answered with a non-police response.
He's been hitting his head with his hands.
But until that crisis response system is built up, there's a call for city, county, and state help coming from police and service providers, a call that so far hasn't fully been answered.
We are here checking up on you.
And joining us to discuss the situation a little bit further, we have with us Brandie Flood. She is Director of Community Justice for REACH, which works with homeless people in our region, connects them to services. Also, Chris Lombard, he is the Interim Director for the new Community Safety and Communication Center, otherwise known as the CSCC. Thank you to both of you for joining me here. And Chris, I'm going to jump right to you and go big picture to start if we could. So I know the city's hope is here by transferring the 911 call center out of the SPD, making it a less police-centric kind of a function. That's going to help provide different, more appropriate response options rather than having an armed officer show up every time. And I know some of these new options we're talking about here haven't completely scaled up yet, but we will get to that. I want to establish, though, this idea of what role you think the CSCC is going to play in this process of overhauling, I should say, how we approach public safety.
We're really excited about the opportunities that we've been afforded here. Councilmember Herbold, who chairs the Public Safety Committee, and Mayor Durkin kind of had this vision of, what else could be done, what else is out there, recognizing that there's this whole group of calls that both SPD and Seattle Fire themselves have identified that their resources, whether that's a firefighter, an EMT, or a police officer, probably aren't the best resource available to send out there to go and help. It kind of stirs up community concern and whatnot. We, up until now, haven't really had any consistent and reliable alternatives. And so Seattle police were always the default position. Got nothing else? Well, send the police. They'll go take a look at it. So in their vision in creating this center, that's the CS part, the community safety element, we started looking around the rest of the country to see what does everybody else do? What are some of the options that are out there? And found just a whole smorgasbord of options that are out there, from mental health practitioners to community engagement police or community engagement officers. Some were full-time, some were voluntary, some were community resources, some were religious, all great, all had their niche and whatnot. So we kind of cherry-picked the best of the different ideas out there to kind of come up with some different concepts. And we recognize that here in our community, in the greater Seattle area, that we have a lot of those same resources available to us. The challenge that we had in the 911 aspect is that 911, with its heart being an emergency, our callers are trained, our call screeners are trained to try to kind of come up with an answer within about 60 to about 120 seconds. Again, because we don't want to be holding up that CPR call or that robbery in progress call. So the idea that we all kind of came up with was a triage element, or what we're proposing to call Triage 1. The idea is that we would have somebody that we know it's not an emergency. We can send somebody out to do a deeper dive, try to find out more information, and that they would be our go-to experts to be able to tap into some of these community resources.
That's great. And I'm going to dive into that Triage 1 issue in just a little bit, Chris. Thank you for that answer there. But Brandie, I want to talk to you about this because standing up the CSCC is really a process that you and Reach and a lot of people are watching very closely. A lot of the vulnerable homeless people you serve are on that fine line between our behavioral health system and our criminal justice system. So what impact do you think this new approach to 911 calls will have on those people? And what are your concerns about how they might be treated?
You know, my biggest concern in thinking about just the big picture about how, you know, racism and white supremacy shows up in all of our systems and even in our crisis systems is that, you know, for most people, crisis to most people is distinct from crime, right? And so crisis is how behavioral health problems for someone not suspect to a crime is categorized. But crime is generally what a behavioral health crisis is labeled as when it's a Black, brown, or Indigenous person. So that's what I'm worried about. Like, who is going to discern for the racial bias? Like you have, like you said, that 60 to 120 seconds. The person is committing a crime, maybe a crime of poverty, theft, trespass, assault or maybe even doing some low-level drug dealing just to feed their own habits. So they are, by law, committing a crime, then the police are going to be called. So for me, that puts Black, brown, and Indigenous people at a higher risk of violence because they're not going to get that alternative resource of a mental health provider or just the fire department. Police will still be called out for those functions. So that's the biggest thing that I worry about, especially when we're trying to work with people who are in the drug using community, unhoused, and Black and brown folks that might be experiencing mental health, but for them, mental health looks like crime. It doesn't just look like mental health crisis because white supremacy is pervasive through our whole system, and not just with white folks, but with everybody. Our systems are institutionalized that way, and so that lens is under. So who's going to be on the other line that makes sure that bias is not there?
Got it. And Chris, maybe I can jump back to you here because I want to try to talk about how 911 calls are processed right now, how you hope they will be processed in the future. So in terms of what you're able to do right now, what is that like? Calling 911, there's a behavioral health crisis apparently going on. What happens when that call comes in?
You know, Brandie brings up some good points. And one of the challenges that we have is that it's all coming in on a phone line, right? We don't yet in 911 have the ability for our call screeners to see a video of what's going on or wave files or anything like that. It really is just the voice on the phone. And so we are wholly reliant on whatever biases that person has or whatever that person who's called 911 is telling us. One of the hopes that we hope for with our protocol system that we'll be implementing over the course of this next year is to try to get a lot more consistency in the questions that are asked and in the way that 911 callers are interrogated and the types of information that we're getting so that we can better send the appropriate response. And there'll be some growing pains, I'm sure, but the hope is that we can, you know, do a much better job at did these consistent questions arrive at a consistent desired output so that we can really start to see some of the issues and the concerns that Brandie was bringing up and try to address those in the call and the question dialogue that's going on with 911 callers.
Yeah, and just briefly on this one, Chris, when do you expect that Triage 1 system to be up and running? I know it's been through a few fits and starts here, hopefully sometime next year. What are we talking about?
So the protocol system's got to kind of come first. That's the question and answers and whatnot. City of Seattle has recently assigned a project manager and we're putting together the team. We expect to have in the first part of next year, the request for proposal, the RFP go out to see of all the vendors that are out there. So over the course, the first part of next year, we'll start with the protocol, the question and answer system. Once that is up there, we're looking at working with fire department. We're looking at working with some of the other city agencies on as a parallel course, trying to stand up the Triage 1 system. It's going to take a little bit longer because it involves actual people and vehicles and where the vehicles are staged and whatnot. But the hope is that probably about the end of next year, you know, maybe late summer in the fall or something like that. That we might be able to have both the question and answers and the resource to go out and kind of do the better look as far as what's really going on.
Yeah, great. Brandie, back to you on this one here. I want you, if you could, to give us the perspective of one of your clients when they're in crisis and there's a 911 call. I think some of the clients that you serve may have some fear of police or other institutions out there, maybe also a fear of calling 911 on their own. I want to try to talk about what the 911 experience is like for them. If you can give us an example, because I know this can get a little complicated.
Oh, it definitely gets complicated at the intersection of crime and behavioral health. And so, I have a lot of clients that are picked up on low-level theft charges. And so I have a woman in particular, African-American woman, a lot of mental health issues that come into play. And then so when she's picked up on stealing like food or an article of clothing or something of that nature, or because she's unhoused, just to be able to couch surf at someone's house, sometimes that's a requirement. I need you to steal something from me to be able to stay there. So it's her livelihood. And then when, it is a crime, unfortunately, the crime of poverty, when security is involved or police are involved, then she feels trapped and feels like she has to fight herself out. All these other traumas come up for her. So it's really a behavioral health issue, but because of her response to them coming on to her, police are going to be called. She is going to be arrested. And then the worst part about it is the community thinks that because someone is taken to jail, they're going to be held legally accountable. But if they're too mentally ill or unwell to stand trial or understand their trial, they're actually not going to be able to be held that way. And legally, the legal system can't engage them because they're not able to go to trial. So then you just keep, putting people through the jail system and just harming them, and then essentially a negative impact on the community. So how do we look at what accountability should look like? Who is going to show up at that intersection of crime and behavioral health for those folks where the mental health crisis line won't? So I also run the LEAD program within REACH. And so we need more LEAD-like services that are going to come at that moment in time where we can divert that charge and get that person to robust services instead of just in and out of jail. So those are just some things that to think about when we're thinking about alternative services.
Got it. And Chris, let me go back to you here and just talk about this. What happens when there's a call that maybe doesn't need a police response to start with and then does need one later on? I'm trying to figure out how your dispatchers, how your call takers are going to deal with something like that, because that's complicated too.
I think this is the niche that Triage 1 concept is going to fill. The whole idea, and we built this on Seattle Fire Department's experience with the Health 1 program.
Right.
Working for the fire department, I've been in the fire service for about 30 years, about 27 of those with Seattle. And you really get to know the people, even if they're unhoused people on the street and whatnot. The idea with having this consistent Triage 1 system is that they'll know what's going on. And, an example, fictitious scenario might be that, 911's not sure who it is. They know that there's some, person that's yelling at a lamppost. We send out Triage 1 to go investigate a little further. Triage 1, they'll get there, and with their street experience, this is Mike. Mike's got some challenges. He's not a threat to himself. He's not a threat to society. It's maybe that Mike's just off his medication. So what we're able to do, much easier, much faster, and certainly much cheaper for the system, is we're able to, hey, Mike, let's get you your medicine. Let's go refill your prescription or something like that. We keep Mike out of jail. We keep, we keep the jail space that itself is kind of at a premium. We keep that available. We keep police dealing with more serious crimes. We keep him out of the hospital. So it's, we have a lot of hopes for this Triage 1 system.
Brandie, let me go to you on this. I want to know about civilian social service workers who are trying to help people in crisis. Do they want an armed officer with them for protection, or let me know about that. Do they need that? Some thoughts on this.
I would say we don't want armed officers with us when we're going out in the community. In most cases, we've already been doing a lot of outreach in the community, so our role is kind of preventative. So the people already. I will say in those instances where you don't have a relationship with the person, this is your first time encountering the person, it changes things. Even for the first responders that Chris is working with, it changes things when you show up and you don't know the person. So that's that nuance that, we really have to think about in doing the work. We need more low barrier spaces for people in crisis or experiencing mental health issues where they can be stabilized in healing-centered ways. And so it makes it hard for all involved, outreach workers, our first responder workers, things of that nature. But typically no, because we're already out there on a daily basis, building relationships and trying to take preventative messages. So like you said, when we show up, I know this is so-and-so who needs their meds. I know this person, something happened last night and they got kicked out of shelter. And they feel under stress or something of that nature.
Let me try to take a next level, though, with you here, Brandie. I want to talk about involuntary detentions, a situation where a crisis maybe has escalated here and the person in question needs to be taken into detention against their will. What is this experience like for the people you work with and for outreach workers who get involved with these decisions? This is another complicated issue.
Oh, it's really hard. And I'm particularly worried about our Black, Brown, and Indigenous people who get in that situation, because usually for them, they're met with a jail response first, only to stay in jail for a little while later to be IT'd into a mental health system. And then the dilemma is they're too unwell to deal with the situation, but not sick enough to actually stay in a psychiatric hospital. We have limited spaces for people to go dealing with acute crisis, post-crisis, immediate. Like, we need to have more options for our providers, for first responders, and folks like me, homeless outreach workers, to have people go to those spaces. There's just not enough of them, and they don't work because they go in and out. They're not well enough to be out in the street, but they're not sick enough to stay in these spaces and be in between. So it puts us at a dilemma.
Yeah, very much so. And Chris, let me get your perspective on this, because there's a lot of concern from police officers right now about involuntary detentions. House Bill 1310, enacted this year, set up some rules around the permissible use of force by officers. It's led to some confusion, and I've seen a number of reports showing officers around the state are sometimes refusing to follow through when an involuntary detention order is given. It just feels like a dangerous situation for everybody involved here. So what's happening with this issue of involuntary detention, or what needs to happen to try to help resolve it?
Well, again, this is where we're going to be putting a lot of emphasis or a lot of weight on, like, some of these Triage 1 type concept units at first. The hope is that these Triage 1 folks, they will have a much better idea on the resources and street smarts, for lack of a better term. They'll be able to say, okay, we're going to approach, and we see, you know what, maybe this is a particular call where maybe we do want police to be in the area, but not necessarily right up front in the call. So maybe we call and we talk back, hey, we need police to stand by a block away. Then we can safely approach and find out, okay, we're good. Go ahead. We release the police. They start to interview the patient. You know what? This person's a good candidate for REACH, or this person's a great candidate for Catholic Community Services, or this, again, somebody in a position, or the Triage 1, where they can actually take much longer to go through the scenario and the call and have a lot more information to make a much better educated choice than we can over a phone line in the 911 center.
Thank you for that. Chris, I want to make sure that I talk quickly with you about staffing. It's been a concern, I know, for the CSCC and the Seattle Police Department. The mayor recently enacted an executive order to set aside some hiring bonuses for call takers and dispatchers too. Tell us about where your staffing numbers are right now and where they need to be, and hopefully the impact of these bonuses too.
Yeah, no, it's so 911 nationwide has actually had some real struggles, and certainly we have not been immune to that here in the city of Seattle. Starting with the events in the summer of 2020 and then continuing through this year, we've lost a lot of people that were just, it wasn't what they thought it was. Put a lot of stresses on the 911 call takers and whatnot. Unfortunately, the more we lost, the more stress that was amounted on the remaining call takers and whatnot. So we were kind of getting into this, I won't say a death spiral, but it was getting pretty bleak. The mayor and the council worked, to kind of come up with these bonuses, and we saw almost immediately a 5-fold increase in the interest. So our hope is that, we're kind of starting to level out and starting to regain some of the ground in the hiring. And that's where it starts. 911, they're the first responders and whatnot. So hopefully we're going to start seeing things look a lot better this winter.
Thank you for that. And Brandie, I wanted to go bigger picture on the budget here, because the city did invest some more money in mobile behavioral health crisis services in this last session here. More money into LEAD, which I know you've worked a lot with, law enforcement assisted diversion. But then I know a lot of advocates like REACH and DESC were calling for a lot more money to go towards some of these diversion programs in behavioral health. I just want to ask what impact you think these new investments from the city will have on crisis prevention.
Yeah, and I will say for LEAD, right now it's Let Everybody Advance with Dignity is the name, formerly Law Enforcement Diversion Program. I want homeless service workers and behavioral health workers to be paid the same rate as first responders. People are out there in encampments doing this work with some of the most complicated people in our city, the most complex. The people who are still out there are the ones that just can't fit in any system because they have too many issues. And so those people are working with high-risk folks, and they're not even paid a living wage enough to even live in Seattle.
Yeah.
Most of our staff work a second job.
Yeah.
Most of our staff live outside of Seattle and have to travel into Seattle to do the work. And that's just not the way to create a workforce that is able to serve very complicated people. They have to be paid well to be able to do the work.
Got it. All right. Chris, I wonder if I could, 20-second version here. The state's bringing online this 988 system. Looks like it'll be coming online July of next year. Help me out with this briefly, if you could. How does this mesh with what you're doing here? What's the idea there going forward?
There's still a lot remains to be seen on that.
Okay.
We're not exactly sure. We're still kind of in the dialogue with the state as to how that line will be staffed. Are they going to transfer stuff to us? Do we transfer stuff to them?
Okay.
What resources do they have? So it really is, it was just passed out of the last legislature.
Right.
And so now the hard work begins in trying
Fair
to figure
enough.
out the nuance to how it's going to work.
Fair enough. We need to wrap up here. And Chris, I'll start with you here. I want to talk about the growth of CSCC going forward. So the City Council has talked about bringing in community service officers under CSCC's control, building up the department in that way. And I know there are some challenges with that. Some officers want to stay with the SPD. Plenty of union negotiations to consider there too. But you're the interim director of this department right now. You're helping Mayor-elect Herbold find a permanent leader. How are you advising him in terms of the growth of this department and what assets should be part of it?
If you use the crawl, walk, run analogy, we are still crawling. We're still hiring some of our basic back end staff, payroll, purchasing, financing, and whatnot. So our hope is to continue to fill out kind of the basic staff. With that, we've reached out. We're reaching out to the fire department. They're a fully vetted, fully developed department to help us launch some of the other initiatives, the triage one that we've been talking about. So hopefully, the timing is going to be such that it all kind of comes together. Okay. So we're getting there, but still a little bit more time to build out just the basic 911 services.
All right, we're going to keep in touch. Brandie, final thoughts from you. By next year, how do you think this new crisis response system is going to affect public safety? I'm talking about the general public and the people you work with too, the people that are in crisis.
It's still too early for me to make a determination. I hope that it makes sure that we have community safety for all people, not just business owners and homeowners, but safety for everybody who lives in the community. I hope that we really think about the implications to how racism shows up in our crisis world and in our public safety world, to make sure that we're taking care of all people, especially Black and brown people in our community, as this alternative line has come up from the aftermath of some of the horrible things that have happened in our safety system to Black and brown folks. And so, and then to Chris, you had the ear of Mayor-elect, so I hope you are going to talk to him about also making sure that you guys are able to connect and collaborate with your community organizations so that we can be more a part of the crisis conversation and meeting with you guys regularly, and even smaller programs that are working in communities of color, like Choose 180 and things of that nature, where we could really have a collaborative approach to crisis and helping with the triage one, because I want it to work. I don't think police need to be called out all the time. So I really want it to work, and I especially want it to work for folks in my community.
All right. Well, I know everybody wants it to work. Thank you both for joining us here. Appreciate the conversation, and we will be right back. What are people saying on social media about Seattle's crisis response system? One writes, decreasing the role of policing and incarceration in our communities and creating care-based alternatives keeps us safe. Another comments, we will never have adequate public safety without adequate law enforcement. We'd like to know what you think. Send us an email at contact@seattlechannel.org or find us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Coming up next week, political lines are about to be redrawn in Seattle to reflect the city's dramatic growth, and it may affect which elected officials represent you after the next election. Making sense of the census. That's all on the next City Inside Out. I hope you join us.